So we're going through a little series talking about discussing what our original purpose is, which, if you remember, is to image God, that we have a role that we play within this system, and that is to co-rule. In other words, we're supposed to follow the things that God asked us to do as we're out in originally the garden, but then we're out of the garden now, we're out of Eden, we've been exiled out into the fields of the world, and we have a job to do, and it's kind of set up as being a gardener. And again, these are, I think there's an element of actually gardening, right, that is originally set up out of this, but ultimately it is a metaphor for caring for God's creation. One of the strange things that you realize when you spend a lot of time in these first few chapters of Genesis is that you don't see them planting anything. It's really the garden of God, it's the realm of God, and He puts humans in there to take care of that. And so we've looked at that. We know now we're in the field, we've been kind of exiled out into the field, and that's where we're spending our time. And it's tough out being in the field, being out in the world and away from the place that was made for us and that we were made for. It becomes kind of challenging. And so that our starting location was a garden. Our current location is a field. We saw where Jesus comes back. He's resurrected from the grave in a garden tomb. And from there, he departs out into the fields. He sends his people out into the fields. And a few thousand years later, here we find ourselves doing exactly the same thing. We're following Jesus in the fields, doing the kind of things that we should be doing in the field with people, loving people, caring for people, being merciful, showing kindness, trying to care for the widow, for the orphan, for those who need that kind of care and concern out there. And that's where we find ourselves. But what we're going to see today, we're going to just start to look at a couple of characters through Scripture and see how they handle themselves in the field. And what's interesting you're going to see is that the writers, the authors, rarely, if ever, sermonize about these characters. In other words, they don't really tell us what to think about them. They simply put the behaviors and the actions of these characters in front of us, and then they leave, and then they just move on. And they leave it to us to look at and try to understand how we see ourselves in these characters and in these folks. And so as we do that this morning, we're going to see that just like them, we often have struggles following directions. And just like them, we have struggles with caring for things in the field that maybe we shouldn't be so interested in caring about. And we lose track and lose sight of those kind of things that we should be doing. And so just something to kind of keep in mind as we go through some of this is to watch for those and see if there's a way for you to see yourself in some of these characters. So with that, we're going to jump in and just kind of, introduce that a little bit. Failing to follow directions in the field can have unwanted effects and can hurt some people along the way. Now, I'm not saying that's you or that's us, but that's the first character that we're going to look at today. That directions, what God has asked people to do, is very specific, and we're going to see folks who are maybe not so interested in taking that direction, or maybe they just don't know. Maybe they're just not sure what to do with it. And the first character we're going to look at is a character by the name of Abram, which you may know as Abraham or Father Abraham, and his wife Sarah or Sarai. They started out as Abram and Sarai, and then God changed their names later on. But these two characters are kind of where it begins. When you come out of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you see that humanity has made some really unusual and poor decisions. And God has determined to take one family and essentially start over with one family. And that starts with the family of Abraham and Sarah. God picks a family who is unable to have children, which doesn't make a lot of sense in the equation if you're going to start over rebuilding a family to redeem the earth to start with a couple that is unable to have children. But that's who he starts with. And I just, as a reminder, in these days, when they're writing this, there is no concept of how fertility works, not scientifically like we understand today. There would have been absolutely no concept at all that a man would be infertile, okay? These are people of the field. And so when you plant a seed, the seed grows typically based on whether the soil is able to support it. I'll let you put two and two together on what I'm saying, okay? So they don't have any concept as to how any of that works. And so let's just kind of keep that in mind. And in addition to that, when God calls them, they're really not youngsters anymore. It's not like he calls a couple of 20 or 30-somethings out, all right? It's not. They're beyond, as the author would say, their childbearing years, okay? And that's just the reality. So you might look at this and think, does God know who he's picking? He knows exactly who he's picking. He knows exactly what he's getting into. And it's all for a purpose and for a reason. But within this story, which has been severely condensed today, so we're going to try to take you through quickly as much as we can, we're going to see how the first couple shows up and begins to function and operate in these fields outside of the garden. And maybe we can see ourselves in them a little bit, and it might be able to take something away. So, you ready? Here we go. Now the Lord said to Abram, remember, they start off as Abram, they become Abraham and Sarai. Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to a land. I'm going to send you somewhere, to a land, which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. Remember, they're childless. And I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. This is the promise from God to Abraham when God calls Abraham and says, you're in a location in the ancient Near East, and I want to remove you from there, a place called okay? And I'm going to send you somewhere else to a place I'm going to show you. And I'm going to take you and your wife who've been unable to have any children, and I'm going to make many descendants from you. And yes, I know you're old, but let's get on with it. Okay? Let's pack up your stuff. I want you to leave your relatives, and I want you to leave your father's house. Just grab Sarah and what you can carry, and let's go. Now, are these seemingly fairly simple instructions? Do these seem easy enough? Like, in other words, if God showed up to you today, would you understand these instructions? Would they make sense to you? Okay, good. Let's see how Abram does with this, okay? Because right out of the gate, we've kind of got his first failure, right? So Abram went forth. Good job, Abram, as the Lord had spoken to him. Oh, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, and Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated. Do you see a problem? Right off the bat. What were the directions to go into this land, into this field? Take you and your wife, leave your relatives and your father's house, and you go. And right immediately, it's like Abram says, hey, Lot, come on over, because I'm 75 years old. Be nice to have a nephew, because Lot's his nephew. He's family. Sure, God only meant, not relatives, just the relatives you don't want to bring along, right? Like if you could pick the relatives to go to a new land, you'd kind of be like, I'll take Lot, but you stay, and you stay, and right? He brings Lot with him. Right out of the gate. They haven't even left haven't even left home. They're still packing the minivan. And we've missed it. And this should be an indicator to us, right, just immediately that it's hard to follow directions. It's really hard for biblical characters to follow directions, right? And so maybe it'll get better. Maybe it'll get a little bit better, okay? So they head out. They go down, and it says Abraham reaches the land, and here's how it goes. Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. They have foreigners in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, quote, "To your descendants." Remember, they have not been able to have children. "To your descendants I will give this land." So he, that's Abram, built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. And then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. So God is still appearing. He hasn't given up. This is a good thing for us to recognize in the story. You can be given a direct instruction and fail to follow the instructions, and you're thinking, well, is God done with them already? No, we're going to work with this. Okay, so you brought Lot. I told you not to, but you brought him anyway. But I'm still going to give you and your descendants this land. Now remember, Sarah and Abram cannot have children. And we've yet to see a question about this in Abram or Abraham's mind. We haven't seen it yet. But the promise is still there. It's still effective. So, leave your family, leave your father's house. Didn't quite get that done. Let's see how it goes in the land. Okay? Now, there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt. Wait. He's in the land where God has appeared. Do you remember that preceding verse? God has appeared to him. He goes to a place called Bethel and he builds another altar there. God is appearing to Abraham. Just as a side note, Bethel, if you want to know what the word means, Beth means house or Beit, and El means God. It's house of God. That's what Bethel means. Kind of like Bethlehem, house of bread. So we're in the land, and there's a famine. And when there's a famine, what's the first thing that he does? He heads south, or I like how the author puts in the word down. If you were with us during the Jonah series, Jonah goes down, right? Now, yes, on the map, this is down. Egypt will be down from where they are. But I think it's a little twist in the verbiage to go, he wasn't supposed to leave the land. Did God say go to Egypt? There's a famine in the land. Have we seen in the history of the Old Testament God helping people in a time of famine? I can think of a people that wandered a desert for 40 years with no food, and yet somehow food showed up. But in this case, there's a famine. Now, why would he do this? This is what Abram is used to doing. This is what you do when there's a famine in the land. You go to where there isn't one. You go to where it's raining. You go to where there are crops. This is just what you do. But he's leaving the land that God has sent him to. And this is going to turn out to be a bit of a problem, as you might suspect. So what happens? He comes to Egypt, and he said to Sarai, his wife, "See now, you are good looking, even at 75. Okay? You're good looking. And when these Egyptians see you, they're going to say, 'This is his wife? Like, this is her?' And they'll kill me. But they'll let you live because you're so pretty. So please tell them you're my sister. That way they'll let me live. Because of you, I could live." Okay. Do you see the trouble? They're in the land. They leave the land, weren't told to. They get to a new land where now we're going to open up the relationship with lying. And how in the world does Abram assumed that they're just going to end up in front of Pharaoh. Think about that for just a minute. They're just travelers coming in from the land of Canaan. She must have been something to look at. If you just wander in as a stranger and some guy's like, hey, Pharaoh, check this out. But to scheme like this, to open up with a lie and deception, right out of the gate, can I tell you, let's just remember what one of the promises is. Through you, Abram, you will be a blessing to all the families of the earth. And this is his opening representation to other families of the earth. How's Abram doing? How's he doing? And it's easy for us to sit here and play armchair quarterback on biblical characters. Okay, we weren't there. We can be like, well, I would never have done that. I don't know, maybe you would have. Maybe I would have. That's the whole point. And you notice the author never steps in to go, and Abraham sinned, and he did this wrong. You've not read any of that here. He's just painting the story for you. That's it. That's it. So what happens? They get there, and indeed, Sarah is beautiful, and Pharaoh takes her in to his home as his wife. He takes her in. And they really believe that Abram is her brother, right? And this becomes a problem. What does God want to do? He wants to bless and redeem the nations through Abraham. And his deception with Sarah and Pharaoh turns out to be exactly the opposite. Here we go. But the Lord, because Pharaoh had married Sarah, struck Pharaoh and his house. Remember, this is supposed to be a source of blessing. But his decisions in the field are creating problems for other people. He strikes Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Some people will argue over this and see God's not one, there he is striking it again. But all of this was preventable if Abraham and Sarah, they're in this together, okay, had just followed directions. We wouldn't be in this position. Then Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you've done to me? What did I do to you? You came here for food. What are you doing to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Okay? Take her and go." Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away with his wife and all that belonged to him. It's sort of God's way of going, get back to where I sent you. But at this point, how does Pharaoh and the Egyptians, how would you be looking at these people? This is the father of the nation that is supposed to redeem all of the families of the earth, and this is his opening move. Following directions in the field, it's hard to do. And can you imagine, just ladies, think for this for just a minute. Can you imagine having this conversation with your husband? That you would agree to this? That you would agree to go and do this? They're just not, it's just not working. And how is it that Pharaoh is the righteous one in this story? Pharaoh is the righteous one. It's hard to follow things in the field. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, and he and his wife and all that belonged to him. Oh, and Lot, by the way, he's still traveling with them too. Okay? They're off to a great start. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold. He went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he'd made there formerly. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. And we're going to find out that Lot had a lot. Come on, work with me on that one. It's a good one, right? Come on. And as it turns out, You know how it is, there's family you like, and so you start to do things with them, and after you've journeyed through the desert, way up north, all the way down to Egypt, and back up with all your flocks and the people and the folks who work with you and family, and that sometimes things get there's some tension that can develop, right? None of you have ever had any kind of tension with your family, if you've kind of been in any kind of relationship with them, especially business-wise. There's never been any tension like that, never been any problems. Well, in this case, there are. Lot and Abraham, they can't quite seem to fit their camps within the same area, and the people who work for them start to fight among each other, start to kill each other, have battles, little fights. It would be like, you're in business. Let's say you're the Ford family, and one side of the production line belongs to one group, and the other side belongs to another. And one day they just start killing each other because one group wants to do left-hand doors, and the other group wants to do right-hand doors, and they just have these fights. And so Lot and Abraham recognize this, and they say, we've got to do something about it. So Abram comes up with this is a brilliant idea, brilliant, on how to solve this conflict with no room. The land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. So Abram said to Lot, please, look, let's not have any strife between you and me, it's all good. Or between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we're brothers. Let's bring this to an end. Abram's a man of peace. He doesn't want to have all of this. And I've got an idea on how we would fix this. Keep in mind, God has sent them to a land, sent Abram to a land that he is going to give who? Abram and his descendants. Okay? So Abram says to Lot, is not the whole land before you? Just look around, Lot. And when we were in Israel, we were actually kind of up on the little hill in Bethel. Remember, we could look out across the whole valley over there. And you can see, for miles. In fact, they would say on a clear day, you can see all the way up into northern Israel, into Mount Hermon, up into Lebanon. That little spot it's a great lookout. And that's where they are. Lot, look at all this land before you. Please separate from me. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. Lot. And Lot, if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. It's brilliant. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before, by the way, the Lord God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. But this place that Lot is looking out, well, first off, is there a problem? Does Abram have permission to give the land away? He treats the field like it's his own possession. And he wasn't supposed to bring Lot anyway. This won't be the first time there's a problem. But Lot looks out, he's like, oh, I get first pick. What's he going to pick? Well, he's going to pick the land of the Jordan, which is like, isn't this interesting phraseology, the garden? It's like the garden of the Lord. They're in a land that's like the garden of the Lord. And here Abram comes and says, take it. It wasn't his to give. It was God who was giving it to Abram. Lot lifted up his eyes. He sees this area is like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself the valley of the Jordan. I bet he did. It's what you and I would do. And Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other, and Abram just gave it away. He just gives it away. But God had something to say about this, because it's immediately after that the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, now you, Abram, lift up your eyes and look from where you're standing to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west. For everything that you see, including what you just gave away, your descendants are going to have. And immediately Abram should be thinking, wait a minute, does that mean I'm going to have to fight Lot for this someday? Guess what? They will. He'll have to fight his own family for it someday. Because he couldn't follow the instructions to just leave your family at home. You and your wife, just come. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be counted. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I'm going to give it to you. As time passes, we see that Abram has to go rescue Lot. Lot gets in trouble with some kings in the area, so they have to go risk their lives to rescue Lot. Lot continues to be a problem because he couldn't leave him at home. It just continues to happen. And God makes these promises to Abram that he's going to have a child. He's continued to say it's going to be your descendants, your descendants, your descendants. Now, there is an act of faith that Abram has done in that he has left Ur. Think about this. He's left Ur on a promise. He's just not behaving very well in the field. He's tried to give away what isn't his. He tried to give his wife away. He's really kind of all about Abram. That's really what he's about. And after some of these things begin to occur as they're spending some time in the land, God comes to visit Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not fear. I'm a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great." Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me since I'm childless?" It's the first time the conversation about children enters in, and we're in chapter 15. We're 3 chapters in. "The heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." Like, I've got to give it to one of my best, employees here. And Abram said, "Since you have given me no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir, then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This man, Eliezer, will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir." He promises him a child. Now, let's just pause here for 2 seconds. He promised to take him to a land that he'll show him and make him into a great nation. How did Abraham handle that? Do you want to take a guess, just as a reader, how Abraham's going to handle the promise of a child? Do you think he may try to take matters into his own hands? Do you think he may try to control and run this himself? I think there's a good chance that that's going to happen. I do. So Abraham's challenged with all of this, and God reiterates this promise. God took him outside and said, "Now look towards the heaven and count the stars." If you can, I'm not even sure you can see him. He's 90 years old. Okay? Count them if you can. And God said to Abram, "So shall your descendants be." And we're in chapter 15, and the first positive thing about Abram is said. Abram believed the Lord. And God said, "That's a good thing you did." It's the first positive thing we see Abram do. He's one of the few characters in all of the Hebrew Bible that gets this statement made about them, that God counted it as righteousness to him. "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it." We're going to try and get Edom going again. And what happens? As time passes, Abraham has his moment of faith we just saw. They have the promise of the child. That fails because they decide they're going to figure that out their own way too. They have a famine. Essentially, in the famine, they went to another land, to an Egyptian. Catch this. They go to Egypt in the famine. And when they're childless, it's Sarah who offers up her Egyptian maidservant to try to fix the child problem. "Here, Abraham, go ahead and take my maidservant without her permission or any courting and just have a child through her." And how does that work out? Turns out pretty bad, doesn't it? Gets pretty rough. And I'm going to use the word, they abuse their maidservant. It's horrible. They fail at that again. And so God comes back and promises them a child one more time. Oh, and by the way, that one time that Abraham lied about Sarah being his sister, he does it again. He is not really running a good track record here. But finally we know in the story that God comes through with a son. We know how that works out. So let me ask you a question. How does it work out when you're in the field, you're exiled from the garden, and you're given these are actually very straightforward instructions. They're not simple. Think about it. If you got to pack up and leave and get out, these aren't simple instructions, but they're understandable. These are not complex. Leave your family, go to a land. I'm going to turn you into a family. And within all of these decisions that Abraham's making, as he's working through this and trying to figure this out, there are 2 times that it shows up that he's faithful and believes God, and it's counted to him. And later authors in the New Testament would look back on Abraham and call him a great man of faith. How is he at following directions? Not so good. Can I ask you a question? How has following directions been going for you? Has it ever perhaps made you feel a little bit like, maybe you didn't deserve to be in this relationship with God, or maybe you weren't good enough to be with this loving, kind, gracious God, or perhaps, you need to bring more, you need to do more, and then you can look at a character like Abraham, the father of Israel, and actually, Paul says he's our father, spiritual father too, and you can look at this character and begin to see for yourself that maybe you're being a little hard on yourself as far as what God considers to be someone worth making a promise with. But on the flip side of that, you can look at it and say, well, I can look at a character like Abraham and think, wow, if I can just follow the directions, then maybe I won't leave a trail of disaster behind me for God to clean up. If he could have just left Lot at home, and I know it's hard to leave, I get it, in an ancient culture, that's got to be really difficult. But if he had just followed the instructions, then he would not have had that whole situation where he makes a promise to Lot and his descendants that turns out to be a fight long after they're dead. He would not have had to go down, and the first image cast about Abraham and this God, Yahweh, that he represents to the Egyptians is one of lying and deception. None of that would have started up. An entire nation of people would not have been set in conflict with Abraham had they just waited for God to come through on the child. And what seemed to be, probably in the moment, this is kind of the important part, what seemed to be just a minor, I'm going to get through this decision. Just maybe God wants us to have a baby through your slave, your Egyptian slave. Yeah, sounds like a good idea. Let's do that. The effect and the consequences over time, well, we still see them today. And yet the flip side is good in that in just 2 times Abraham was faithful. It led to a moment where a Messiah, Jesus, shows up as a descendant of Abraham and makes it so that every nation, every person, every human on earth can join into God's family because of 2 acts of faithfulness out of how many acts of missing it? It doesn't take much. It really doesn't take much. And what it might mean for us is that while we're out in the field, while we're away from Eden, while we're exiled into this land, we may have to change a few things. We may have to wait patiently. I'm not good at that. I don't know about you. We may have to choose some things that we don't want to choose in order for God to work out his kingdom plan. What we have envisioned in our mind may not be at all what God has envisioned in his, so that when we reach the end of our life, we may think, well, you know what I wish or I shoulda or I coulda, may not have ever been what God's plan was. But essentially, in the story of Abraham, you can look at that and say no one can fail as well as he did. He did pretty well. But in his 2 acts of faithfulness, just 2, it's through him that the nations are being redeemed, that they are receiving their blessing, that Jesus makes his offer of salvation available to all, because there were two acts of faithfulness. So here's my question for you. What will your 1 act of faithfulness produce? In spite of all of the decisions where you decided to go to your own Egypt, or you decided to solve these great problems your own way, God can look at that and say, look, make as big a mess as you want. I'd prefer you not to, but I can work around this. But what I can work through in all cases is an act of faithfulness, trust, and belief. And so just imagine what your 1 act of faithfulness can produce generationally over time. That's the perspective that I think, looking into the story of Abraham and how he functions in the land, that's one perspective we can look at and walk away with. That it doesn't take this great, insanely committed, it takes single acts of faith. And you'd be surprised at what God can do with 1. Just 1. He can do amazing things with it. And that's my prayer for you and for us today, is that we find the courage to do that 1 act of faith, trusting and following God while we're in the field. And we can wait and watch and see what he brings about with that.